Our next topic is something called immediately invoked function expressions. So let's take a look at what they are. So sometimes in JavaScript, we need a function that is only executed once and then never again. So basically a function that disappears right after it's called once. And this might not appear to make much sense right now, but we actually need this technique later, for example, with something called async await. So how could we do that? Well, we could simply create a function and then only execute it once. So run once function this will never run again, and then we can call it here. However, we can actually run this function again at some other point in the code if we wanted to, right? There's nothing stopping us from later doing run once again, right? And so this is not what we want to do. We want to actually execute a function immediately and not even having to save it somewhere. And so this is how we do that. So we simply write the function expression itself. So without assigning it to any variable. Now, if we try to run this, we will get an error for now. And so it says function statements require a function name. And that's because, of course, JavaScript here expects a function statement, because we simply started this line of code here with the function keyword. However, we can still trick JavaScript into thinking that this is just an expression. And we do that by simply wrapping all of this into parentheses. And so now we basically transformed the statement that we had before into an expression. And so now if we save this, we get no error. But also this function didn't execute yet, right? We never called it. So we know that this here is the function, and so we can then immediately call it. And so with this, we will get now this text here logged to the console, this string. And indeed, here it is. All right. So again, this here is really just the function value. So it's just a function expression. And then immediately we call it here. And so this is why this pattern here is called the immediately invoked function expression, or IIFE for short. So immediately invoked function expression. And the same would, of course, also work for an arrow function. So let's just copy this. This will also never run again. So if we try to call it like this, then it would not work. And so we actually don't get an error, but also nothing happens. So we first need to wrap this into parentheses, and then as we call it, then here it is. Okay, so two ways of writing an immediately invoked function expression. But you might be wondering, why was this pattern actually invented? Well, we already know that functions create scopes, right? And what's important here is that one scope does not have access to variables from an inner scope, right? For example, right here in this global scope, we do not have access to any variables that are defined in the scope of any of these functions here, right? So for example, let's add a variable here. Let's say is private equal to 23. And then as we tried to access it out here, you already know that it's not going to work, right? And that's because the scope chain only works the other way around. So the inner scope would have access to anything defined outside here in the global scope, but the other way around, the global scope does not have access to anything that is inside of a scope. So in this case, of the scope created by this function here. Therefore, we say that all data defined inside a scope is private. We also say that this data is encapsulated. So for example, this is private here is encapsulated inside of this function scope that's created here. And data encapsulation and data privacy are extremely important concepts in programming. So many times we actually need to protect our variables from being accidentally overwritten by some other parts of the program or even with external scripts or libraries. And I'm going to talk in detail about these concepts in the object-oriented programming section. But for now, keep in mind that it's important to hide variables and that scopes are a good tool for doing this. And this is also the reason why the immediately invoked function expressions were invented. So basically this pattern here. So this is not really a feature of the JavaScript language. It's more of a pattern that some developers came up with and that then started to being used by many other developers. Now, do you remember what also creates a scope in ES6? And that's right, variables declared with let or const create their own scope inside a block. And we learned that in the behind the scenes section. Remember? So when we create a block like this and declare is private in there, then the outside can still not access is private. So let's comment out this one and paste it here. And once again, we cannot access this variable. While on the other hand, this one here would of course be accessible. And so again, that's what we learned in one of the previous sections. So that's because this one here was declared with var, and therefore it does completely ignore this block here, essentially. And this is the reason why now in modern JavaScript, immediately invoked function expressions are not that used anymore. Because if all we want is to create a new scope for data privacy, all we need to do is to just create a block like this, right? There's no need to creating a function to create a new scope. Unless, of course, we want to use var for our variables, but we already know we probably shouldn't do that, right? Now, on the other hand, if what you really need is to execute a function just once, then the IIFE, so the immediately invoked function expression pattern, is still the way to go, even now with modern JavaScript. And we will actually see a great use case a bit later of doing an IIFE.